All right, welcome everybody to Nashville and the rest of the soggy world in Middle Tennessee. We've had torrential rainstorms here in the last hour, so yeah, we're all kind of drying off and shaking off umbrellas and everything. But I hope some folks are watching from home, and I know some folks will be watching the recording later on, so we're going to power through and talk about Queen Elizabeth. So welcome. Here are a couple of famous portraits of her as a young woman at 13, at 29, and at 42. The middle one was quite interesting to me because it was only discovered in 2019. It showed up in the possession of a family in California, and they had it cleaned, and the art restoration people said, "That's Queen Elizabeth." So they shipped it off to London, where it auctioned off for $450,000. Nice. Yeah, which is when you have the artist identified as the workshop of, for it to fetch that sum is quite amazing. Okay. Rumble, rumble. All right. If I can go next slide, please. My computer is not going to cooperate. So there, I got 3 more pictures. So there are some pictures of her as she got older, in her 50s and 60s. She died at 69, actually. And that last one is a woodcut, so probably not from a live sitting. But the other 2 probably are. George Gower became the court painter. The one on the left is a particularly interesting one because it has been dubbed the Armada portrait. You have to actually kind of get up close and look, but and it's cropped to fit on this screen. Exactly. Through the window, over her right shoulder and left shoulder, there are a bunch of ships sinking. Yep. So it's called the Armada portrait. All right, moving on. So, welcome. This lecture is, of course, being sponsored by the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. Founded in 2004, our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. And it is named for the influential theologian and apologist Francis Schaeffer from the 20th century. And we'll click up the next paragraph. In addition to sponsoring this lecture series, Schaeffer Study Center offers a high school program built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization, beginning with the ancient world in 9th grade and finishing with the 20th century in 12th grade. Actually, we get it into the 21st now a little bit. We also offer a full set of science curriculum, a set of inductive Bible courses, and a capstone worldview class for our seniors. Next slide. That's me. Rob Scherer, married for 48 years. We're coming up on our 49th anniversary in August. We have 12 children, 3 sons and 9 daughters, and 22 grandchildren so far. And yes, I do have a spreadsheet with all the birthdays. My background, I have an undergraduate degree from Davidson College in history and German, and a graduate degree from Stanford in history and humanities. I have been, all my life really, a historian, a teacher, and more recently an author. I was a college professor for a while. I was a city manager for a while. That detour was quite interesting. I'm a publisher along with my wife, Greenleaf Press. And along with my wife, we are co-directors of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. Okay, you know this next question was coming. What's something you already know about Queen Elizabeth? And I got more pictures of her.
She really liked makeup.
She did. She was very particular about her appearance, and by all accounts, she remained quite beautiful into old age. She was very conscious of her figure, even though she had given up on marriage by about 45, one last attempt in her 40s, and it didn't come to anything. But she knew how to cut a figure, and she loved to dance, and she loved to go to parties, and she loved to dress up. She loved to show off. And she loved to do tours through the country and to greet her people, much to the chagrin of her private secretaries, who fussed about her exposing herself to all kinds of risks by stopping the carriage and greeting people in the marketplaces, but she insisted that's what she wanted to do.
Came by her flamboyance, honestly.
Yes, I think she did. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about her family background. So, next slide. Our main sources of information about here, and you can flip through the first one. The British have been very good about keeping state papers. There's national archives, and of course, England has never been conquered since 1066, so they've never been pillaged or ransacked or destroyed. So we still have letters, reports, Privy Council minutes, diplomatic correspondence, and documents. Next slide. Oh, you're ahead of me. That's okay. Leave them all up. She wrote letters, and we still have them. She wrote speeches and was quite a powerful speaker, in contrast to other female monarchs who sort of felt a little shy about taking a public speaking role. In any event, she addressed Parliament. She addressed her troops on the eve of the encounter with the Armada, and she was quite an excellent writer. We'll talk about how she came by that. Part of it has to do with these next two gentlemen here, who were her. The first of whom was her tutor, Roger Ascham, who was a professor at Oxford, and was her tutor from 1548 to 1550. So from the time she was about 15 until 17 or 18. And he wrote a book in 1570 while she was still alive called The Schoolmaster, where he wrote about how they had conducted their lessons and what she had given him. They did for the classical languages, he taught her Latin and Greek. They did a double translation method. So he would give her a passage from the Aeneid or from the Iliad, several pages, and she would have to translate it from Greek or Latin into English. Then they would put the Latin and the Greek text away, and she would take her translation and translate it back into Latin or Greek, which really polishes your ability with the language both ways. And she was good at it. And then we have an early biography begun only about 12 years after her death. It's a near contemporary history of her reign. Many people who had been alive during her reign were still available to be interviewed. It was commissioned by James I, and he drew on state papers, eyewitness reports, and it's very fawning and flattering to her. James did not feel at all in her shadow, and so he didn't mind that there would be a biography of Elizabeth that was portraying her in as a golden age, her reign as a golden age. And a lot of our opinions of her can be traced back to Camden. All right, secondary sources. Anne Somerset wrote a great biography in 1991. Next up. Wallace McCaffrey wrote a great biography in 1993. Both of them are quite good, still worth reading. Alison Weir wrote one in 1998 that actually made the London Times bestseller list. These are academic biographies. He was a very good writer. David Starkey wrote a very good book in 2000 that just focused on her youth and childhood up to the time of her coronation. And it's called The Struggle for the Throne. And he did incredible research on what had been a somewhat obscure part of her life. And then the last three, Susan Duran. Next one is also Susan Duran. And the last one is John Guy. And I've got those over here with me. This is the first one. She is an Oxford professor of history. And this is actually my favorite. It looks as though the text might be a little bit too popularized. It's heavily illustrated because they had the cooperation of the British Library and the Portrait Gallery. But the text is excellent. And it's short. It's only 130 pages. So for anybody who wants to get an overview of Elizabeth, I really recommend these. This actually is a great series, a total of 8 books. I'll talk about that in a minute because I got intrigued by that. So this author actually went on, and then that second book by her, published 12 years later, is kind of a collective biography. This is not actually a biography of Elizabeth. This is a biography of parents and siblings, the Suffolk cousins, Mary Queen of Scots, who was her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who's also related to her, and then her closest advisors, Robert Dudley, Sir Christopher Hatton, and the Earl of Essex. And she nicknamed them. She nicknamed a lot of her friends. So Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, she called Eyes. And Sir Christopher Hatton, one of her secretaries, she called Lids. And Robert Devereux, actually, he called himself her most humble vassal. Note to self, he wasn't. And then there's a chapter on the women who served as her ladies in waiting. Here are the 3. The counselors. Those were the courtiers. The counselors are what I was thinking about. Sir William Cecil, Sir Spirit, Sir Francis Walsingham, the Moor, he had a dark complexion, and Sir Robert Cecil, who was the second son of Sir William, but he was only about 4'10", and so her pet name for him was the Pygmy. She apparently didn't mind. At least, you don't tell the Queen you mind. All right, next slide. Here are these 8 volumes that I suddenly discovered. They were all published 2003 to 2005, so I somehow they escaped my attention. And I was looking frantically across the internet going, this one is so good on Elizabeth, I wonder if there are more. And sadly discovered that they published them for about 3 years and then they stopped. So Queen Elizabeth, Sir Francis Drake, Oliver Cromwell, and George III. I have the other 7 of them coming from me from ABE used bookstores. And then the bottom row, more recent, Horatio Lord Nelson, the Duke of Wellington, T.E. Lawrence, and Winston Churchill. And they're separate academic authors for each of them, but if they match the style of the Durand, which was the first one published and also historically, then I'm looking forward to it. I'm also looking forward to reading the Sir Francis Drake one because he's a contemporary. His nickname was My Little Pirate, because he was. All right, next slide. So I have told you over the past couple of years, every time I start a new figure, it's genealogy and geography. The geography on this one's easy because England is sort of right where it's always been and its borders haven't changed much. But the genealogy is a little crazy, but it helps explain Elizabeth. In fact, if you don't know the genealogy and the story of her grandparents and parents and aunts and uncles, you will not understand her and how she approached her reign as queen. So Henry VII is her grandfather. Henry VII is the founder of the dynasty. He became king in 1483 when he defeated Richard III and actually killed him on the field of battle at Bosworth. He was known as the Earl of Richmond at that point. And he did have a claim. He was descended from Owen Tudor, hence the House of Tudor. So, next slide. He has 2 sons. There are also 2 daughters, but that would make our story more complicated than it needs to be. One of the daughters married the King of France. The other one married the King of Scotland. That just makes the story more complicated. So he has 2 sons. Arthur and Henry. And Arthur, born in 1486, and Henry, born in 1491. So succession is pretty well in hand. Next slide. And then tragically, Arthur died. Still a spare son. Henry had originally been prepared for a career in the church. Arthur was going to be king, and Henry was going to be Archbishop of Canterbury. But things changed. Arthur died in 1502. He was only 16. And Henry was only 11. So his theological education hadn't really progressed that far. But he was being prepared for it. So next slide. When Henry VII dies, his son Henry becomes Henry VIII king at 17. And he was the dashing Renaissance prince. We think of him as the old fat guy with 6 wives. That's not who he appeared to be when he became king. He was sort of the great hope of the Renaissance scholars. He had been given a classical education. He was fluent in Latin and Greek. He composed songs. He could play the lute. He loved to go hunting. And he was a quite dashing young prince. The complication in his accession to the throne was, next slide, Arthur had been married. And so Arthur's bride, Catherine of Aragon, had been widowed. She had been a widow for 7 years when Henry became king. But the same year he becomes king at 17, he marries her. He's 17, she's 23. She married young. They had no children. And he and Catherine, he was married to her for 14 years. It's the longest of any of his 6 marriages. Over the course of 14 years, actually in the first 9 years of their marriage, they had 6 children. 5 of them died. 4 were stillborn. 1 lived for a little less than 2 months. So Henry is actually emotionally very powerfully and strongly affected by all this. The fact that that 4 of his children were stillborn and 1 had died in infancy, and that only 1 child had survived to adulthood, and it's a daughter. And there had never been a ruling queen in the history of England. It had all been male kings. And so leaving the throne to a daughter didn't seem like a very good option. He's got a problem he's got to solve. It doesn't seem as though Catherine's going to have any more children. So he begins to believe that perhaps the cause of his calamities, the cause of the death of 5 of his 6 children, is that his marriage to his brother's widow violated a passage in Leviticus and violated canon law. You're not supposed to marry your brother's widow. Leviticus says so. Actually, Leviticus goes further and says, you shall not marry your brother's widow, and if you do, you will be childless. And so Henry seems to have become sincerely convinced that he had made a huge mistake in his youth. So, next slide. He solves it by getting that marriage dissolved and marrying again. Catherine of Aragon is just packed off to the country, but the marriage is annulled. The implication of that is his daughter Mary is illegitimate. And his new wife, Anne Boleyn, has a daughter whom they name Elizabeth. So now he has 2 wives and 2 daughters, and they don't all get along. Surprise, surprise. All right, next slide. That's what Elizabeth is born into. Anne Boleyn is accused of adultery, which is treason, and executed. Historians still debate whether the charges were trumped up and whether it wasn't just enemies slandering her, but in any event, she was executed. And the same year that she is executed, Catherine of Aragon died. So no matter what your position is on whether which marriage is valid and which marriage is not, he's now single. And so he marries again, Jane Seymour. And they have a son. And Jane Seymour dies 2 weeks after the birth. But he now has 3 children, and more importantly, he now has a son. All right, next slide. So he goes on and marries 3 more times, and I'll spare you the details of all of that. But his 3 children are all included in his will as he gets older and into the 1540s. He has Parliament pass an act of succession that he had requested, naming Edward as his heir, and if he should die without children, then Mary, his oldest daughter, and if she should die without children, then Elizabeth, his younger daughter. So Mary's actually got her legitimacy restored. Elizabeth actually had been declared illegitimate after the execution of Anne Boleyn. She has her legitimacy restored. Her mother was executed when she was only 3 years old. She really had no memory of her mother. So that's the situation when Henry dies. When he dies, next slide, Edward becomes king. And Edward is a staunch Protestant in opposition to his father, who'd been kind of a lukewarm Protestant. He didn't like the Pope, but he kind of didn't want to change anything about the church, except when they pressured him to dissolve the monasteries because it was going to make him rich in the process. And so he said, yeah, the monasteries are generally corrupt, so let's do that. Edward is surrounded by counselors and advisors who are thoroughgoing Protestants. And Mary and Elizabeth are sort of packaged off to the country. Catherine Howard had been executed. Catherine Parr survived Henry, but only by a year. And so the only surviving one of his wives is Anne of Cleves, whom he had hated from the first moment. I actually didn't hate her. He just said she's ugly. And so that marriage was quickly annulled, and she was given a house in the country and an income. And she actually tried to reconcile the children to each other and their father. And she lived on into the 1550s, not quite long enough to see Elizabeth made queen, but she's happily settled at a house in the countryside. And Edward is king, but he rules only to 1553. He dies apparently of tuberculosis at the age of 16. I don't think he even reached his 17th birthday. And of course, what that means is, by the terms of Henry's will, next slide, Mary is now queen. And Mary rejects every bit of the Reformation. Mary restores the Orthodox Roman Catholic bishops. She deposes any bishops who had adopted Protestant theology. She executes 3 bishops as heretics, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Elizabeth is suspected of being a heretic, and for a time confined in the Tower. Mary's very worried that she might organize a rebellion, an attempt to overthrow her. Mary then does something that alarms almost everybody in England. Next slide. She marries King Philip of Spain, who's also a staunch Catholic. And it looks as though if they have children, then the child of that marriage would inherit both the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Spain. So this could be big. Mary, however, apparently is incapable of conceiving a child. Has a couple of false pregnancies, and then it becomes clear that she is not well. She is only in her 40s, and after a short reign of only about 5 years after her brother's death, she dies. And next slide. That's how we get to Elizabeth. So Philip of Spain is still alive, and he actually sends warm greetings and tries to chat her up. Maybe we can do keep everything in the family. Maybe she's not going to have any of that. She is a Protestant. She has had Protestant friends, Protestant advisors, and she immediately dismisses almost all of Mary's counselors and appoints her own. And that's how we begin her reign. Let me go to the next slide. I'll give you a bit of an overview, then we're going to go back and talk about her early life and education. She's only 25 when she becomes queen. And she's been through this turbulent experience of, her mother was executed for adultery. Her father is kind of a lukewarm Protestant with Catholic leanings. And then her younger brother becomes king, and England goes full Protestant. And then he dies, and England goes full Catholic. And she's still late teens, early 20s. So we'll talk about that more in just a minute. I've only got 4 acts. The first decade of her rule, she rules for 44 years. It's not the longest reign in English history. It actually, I think, falls about 6th right now. Although at the time she became queen, there were only 2 monarchs who had ruled longer than her. She's then passed after her death by, oddly enough, George III and, of course, Victoria, and then finally Elizabeth II, who is the longest ruling monarch in English history. So the first decade, she's got to consolidate things and get a grip on power. She's in her 20s. Next slide. And then we'll talk about the 1570s up to 1587, where she has to deal with plots, rebellion, and Mary. Not Mary, her stepsister or half-sister, but Mary, the Queen of Scotland, who proves a severe problem for 20 years. And we'll talk about how she deals with that. And then finally, Act 4, after the Armada, the Golden Age. So the last 15 years of her reign are what people remember and what people call the Golden Age. But it takes a while for her to get there. All right, next slide. Let's talk about her youth and her education. Next slide. There we go. Yep, 1533, September 7th, Greenwich Palace. And then before her 3rd birthday, she's declared illegitimate when her mother is executed for treason. However, 7 years later, she's 10 years old, and she's restored to the line of succession. The Act of Parliament, where Henry puts his will through, declares her legitimate and a legitimate heir. Henry basically says, I recognize all of my marriages. No matter what we've been saying in between, I now recognize all of my marriages and all 3 of my children as legitimate. She's only 10 years old at that point. Her living arrangements, she did not live at court in London or Westminster. She lived at Royal Manors, Hatfield House in Herefordshire, various other properties at different times, had a small household, maybe a half a dozen to a dozen servants. But a half a dozen to a dozen servants and a royal manor somewhere in the countryside. So it was not an impoverished or deprived upbringing. Next slide. Yeah, she was not at the court, especially after her mother's death. The next phase, for the next 10 years, she had some brief returns to court, especially during her stepmother, Catherine Parr's influence. I mentioned Catherine Parr as wanting to reconcile all of Henry's children. And then finally, when her older half-sister Mary comes to the throne, she is imprisoned in the Tower of London at the age of 20. And then released from the tower, but still under house arrest until Mary's death. All right, let's talk about her education. She was perhaps one of the best educated women of her time. She had a governess, Catherine, who taught her French, Italian, and Spanish. She was fluent in all three. She could converse with the ambassadors from France or from any of the Italian city-states or from the Kingdom of Spain. And then added to that were prominent humanists William Grindal and Roger Ascham. She mastered Latin and Greek. So just 5 languages plus English at her command. And she had studied history, rhetoric, philosophy, theology, music, classical literature. Ascham, when he wrote the book in 1570, when she was in her late 30s, describing his 2 or 3 years as her tutor, said she was extremely smart. Not only smart, but rigorous, disciplined, and she had an engaging style of learning. She mastered the double translation method, equally capable in Latin and Greek. Not Hebrew, but Latin and Greek. Her education prepared her very well for her reign. The languages meant that she could do diplomacy in her own voice, compose her own letters, speak to ambassadors in their native tongue, and her study of rhetoric gave her the ability to make speeches at the court, at the opening of Parliament, to her troops, and she wrote very eloquent letters. I think it's Duran who says that this education built her resilience, political caution, and Protestant sympathies. Ascham and Grindal and Cat Ashley, her governess, were all staunch Protestants. All right, let's talk about that first decade after she becomes king. The very first, queen. The very first thing she has to do is settle the religious questions. Because there had been this turmoil and upheaval from Henry to Edward to Mary, and now we're back to Elizabeth. And she does try and pursue what is called the Via Media. That is not to be too extreme, although she is decidedly Protestant in her theology. There are a lot of the ceremonies of the high church that she still likes and does not want to see abolished. So she likes that there are bishops running the church. She likes that in the worship services there are candles and incense. She likes that the priest in charge is wearing vestments. She's a traditionalist. She finds all of those outward symbols comforting and reassuring. She's very good at choosing her advisors. This is one of the things that marks her. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, served her for 40 years. Was her closest advisor, was her principal secretary. And he was succeeded by his son, who had grown up. His son was the youngest member at that point who had ever been appointed to the Royal Council. He was appointed to the Royal Council at 25. And when his father died, he took over. He's the one who negotiated the accession of James VI, as it was clear that she was in her final illness and dying. So the two of them, father and son. The challenges that she faced, again, we talked about the religious situation. Even though she's back to a Protestant theological position, and in the articles that she's adopted and the directions she's given and the people she's going to select as bishops, the Roman Catholic nobles, of which there are a considerable number, are not happy. There are, on the other pole, there are Puritans as a party emerging. Puritans get their name because they feel like there are too many traces of the old Roman Catholic Church that have not been purified away. They don't like the vestments. They don't like all of the trappings. They don't like the formality. If they're taking their cue from Calvin and John Knox, which many of them are beginning to, they don't like the whole governance of bishops. They would prefer presbyteries, which are councils of ministers. She's also got challenging foreign relations with the two superpowers on the continent, France and Spain. The Holy Roman Empire does not threaten her directly, although the empire is closely allied with Spain. Philip's uncle and then his first cousin are the emperors, but the empire, we've talked about that in previous lectures, the empire is so fragmented and it is so distracted by the Ottoman Turks that it really doesn't have time to fool with these crazy people off on the little island. The French and the Spanish, on the other hand, are very concerned with the people on the little island. All right, a little bit more about the religious settlement. The Revised Prayer Book of 1559 turns out to be the second most influential religious book in the English-speaking world. That prayer book was used by the Episcopal Church and the Church of England in England and the Episcopal Church in the colonies and then the United States until the 20th century, with very few changes. And even the updating that was done in 1925, I grew up in the Episcopal Church, even the updating was done in 1925, changed very little. It sort of became like the new King James is to the original King James. There was another revision in the 1960s, and they introduced some alternate forms for the worship service, which was fiercely opposed by the conservatives and championed by the more liberal. You remember the 60s, right? Well, some of you remember the 60s. I remember the 60s. And the prayer book, well, we won't even talk about the 21st century. The interesting thing about the prayer book is if you look at the doctrine that is embodied, and the prayer book is basically an order of worship. It gives the prayers to be prayed either by the priest celebrating communion or by the congregation in unison or some call and response. It gives different prayers for the church calendar through the year. There's a service for marriage. There's a service for funerals. It's all in the Book of Common Prayer. Basically a script. And this is the way it derives from the Roman Catholic Missal. The Roman Catholic Mass operated through the Middle Ages on a script in Latin. So Luther had done his own religious service in German for the churches that were following his lead in Reform. And Archbishop Cranmer under Henry VIII had begun work on this and published it actually originally at the end of his reign, 1549. Elizabeth asked a committee of bishops to revise that, and they made very, very few changes to it. And in 1568, she authorized a new printing of the Bible called the Bishop's Bible, because she asked the bishops to please review and update the Bible that her father had published. So this is a page from the Henry VIII Bible, 1540. This is a page from Queen Elizabeth's Bible, 1568. And then this is a page from the first printing of the King James. And the interesting thing about all three of these is these were not intended to be pocket Bibles that you carried around with you. These are pulpit Bibles. And when they were authorized by the king, that's why this is called the authorized version. It's because it was authorized for the printer to put one in every church in England. Every church had one on the pulpit. Oftentimes that book was chained to the pulpit. But the other little thing about this that is worth emphasizing is all three of these New Testaments in English are about 90% word for word identical with Tyndale. They tricked Henry. They didn't tell him they'd taken it from Tyndale. They used Tyndale. Tyndale's book's from 1526. 14 years later, they printed the Great Bible approved by the bishops of Henry's church. They didn't tell him they were using Tyndale's text. The Bishop's Bible, I don't think they told Elizabeth either. The King James, most people don't realize this. The New Testament, 90%, word for word, identical with Tyndale. This is a facsimile. There are only two that have survived from 1526. There are a lot of these. These are pages that I picked up in auction. These are actual pages from the 1540, 1568, and 1611 printing. So,
would they have had an issue if they know?
Henry would not have been very happy. I don't know whether Elizabeth had any strong feelings about Tyndale. I don't think James had any strong feelings about Tyndale. He didn't really care about the translation. James approved a new translation, which wound up being just a revision of Tyndale, because he didn't like this Bible. This is the 1560 Geneva Bible, done by the exiles who had fled England during Mary's reign. And the Geneva Bible has comments in the margins. And it talks about how, the midwives were justified in disobeying Pharaoh, and Daniel was justified in disobeying Nebuchadnezzar, and Shadrach, Meshach, and James says, no. And I will authorize a new Bible so long as you don't have any marginal notes. So and this is based on Tyndale. So the text of these four Bibles is really essentially the same. The text of these four Bibles all goes back to this. And the reason James authorized that is, he said, yeah, go ahead. We'll do a new Bible. Just take all the marginal notes out. He didn't.
All that stuff about disobeying kings.
Yeah, take all that stuff about disobeying kings out. Don't like that. All right. Moving on. The other things that she has to deal with. She's single. And we've just been through a turbulent couple of decades because the succession to the throne has been up in the air. So her counselor's first charge to her is, you need to get married. And her response is always, well, who would you suggest? An English nobleman? I mean, there are risks with that. If she marries a Catholic nobleman, that's not going to work. She won't do that. If she marries a Protestant nobleman, he might think he ought to be king and issuing orders. She'd already seen how that was working out for the Queen of Scotland, Mary, whose husband wanted to be given the title of king and wanted to start bossing her around and telling everybody what to do. And she's like, doesn't look like it's a good deal. So what about a foreign prince? She actually had some overtures. An ambassador from Denmark arrived. Prince Eric of Denmark was a Protestant, a Lutheran, but kind of fizzled out. I mentioned Philip II. He actually sent ambassadors and negotiated, and she kind of half-heartedly listened so as not to offend, but she says, there's no way I'm marrying Philip. There was a nobleman, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, one of her counselors. The problem is in 1560, he's married when she becomes queen. In 1560, however, his wife died. Unfortunately, the circumstances of her death were a little scandalous. She was found at the bottom of a short flight of stairs, like 3 or 4 steps, where she had fallen and broken her neck. And so under the circumstances, although she was very fond of Dudley, Leicester, as he's sometimes called. Yes, that is the way you pronounce that. Leicester. It's how we get things like Worcestershire. The Earl of Leicester. They remained close for almost all of her reign, but she felt like she could not endure the scandal because of what had happened to his first wife. She even considered one of the Habsburgs, Archduke Charles of Austria, and there were some negotiations open, but the question was, will he join the Church of England and abide by the Church of England's ceremonial? He says, no, I would like to keep my own priest, and I'd like to celebrate Roman Catholic Mass. And Elizabeth said, no, that's not going to work. Which left her succession up in the air. And as the years go on, it becomes more and more of an issue. One of the biggest problems that she faces, beginning at the end of this first period, is the problem of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. At the end of the 60s, in 1567, her husband had been murdered. The uppity, he's really kind of a Scottish thug. They had been married. He actually had some royal ancestry, but they did not get along. He, in a fit of drunken rage with some of his buddies from a pub, burst into her apartment in Edinburgh in the castle and found her with her Italian singing instructor, and he and his friends murdered him. She was pregnant with James I at the time. So then he flees. He came back, There's some kind of reconciliation. He's staying just outside the city walls of Edinburgh at a cottage. She has gone to visit him. He'd become ill. She's nursing him and bringing him soup and all that good stuff. And then one night, mysteriously, sometime after midnight, the little cottage mysteriously blows up. Something to do with a half a dozen barrels of gunpowder that somebody had rolled into the cellar and lit a match. And he's killed, and she's suspected. She's never really proved, but she is suspected. A couple of months later, she married another Scottish nobleman, James Hepburn, and he's widely thought to have been the guy who rolled the barrels of gunpowder into the cottage. So her Scottish nobles revolted and forced her to abdicate. She fled to England, leaving her newborn son, a year old, in the charge of the Scottish nobility, and they raised him. She never saw him again. She left him at age 1, fled to England, and sought refuge. She was given refuge, sort of house arrest at first, and Elizabeth worked for her restoration in Scotland. James Hepburn, her third husband, her first husband had been King of France before she came back and married the Scottish thug. And her third husband fled to Denmark. He was imprisoned, died in 1578. So by the end of a decade, she's single again. And Mary becomes a rallying figure for English Catholics. She had a claim to the throne. She's actually descended. Remember I mentioned that Henry VII had 2 sons, Arthur and Henry, and 2 daughters. And one of the daughters had married the King of Scotland. Mary Stuart is a granddaughter of that sister. So she has Tudor blood, and if there's no other Tudors around, she has a legitimate claim to be next in line for the throne. And Catholic nobles actually argue, well, the marriage to Anne Boleyn was never valid. He was already married. And Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and then restored, but she was declared illegitimate. So she's illegitimate, then Mary Stuart has the best claim. So she can't really resist the temptation when she becomes a rallying figure for English Catholics. There are rebellions in 1569 and 1570, encouraged by the Duke of Norfolk, and conveniently the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth and at the same time released English Catholics from any oaths or obligations they might have to her.
I'm sure that calmed things down.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that just made everything great. And of course, he doesn't come right out and say that Mary Stuart is the legitimate monarch in England, but that's everybody's conclusion. And so Mary goes from lenient house arrest to being imprisoned. It doesn't stop her from plotting. If anything, next slide. The plots and rebellions. After 1570, there are no more significant plots hatched in England. Mary remains a prisoner, but there are other rebellions in other countries going on. The French Protestants are rebelling against the French king. There are French wars of religion, and they're appealing to Elizabeth for aid. In 1572, the Protestants in the Spanish Netherlands begin a rebellion against Spanish rule. We forget that the Netherlands, Holland, the Dutch, had been a province of Spain. It's where Charles V, the emperor, had grown up. It was part of the Habsburg inheritance. So the Spanish rule that territory, and the Spanish Inquisition is persecuting heretics, which is every Protestant in the Netherlands. So there's a rebellion going on there. And then, to make matters worse, so we've talked about the Netherlands and the rebellion in France. In 1572, the French Queen Mother organizes a massacre of all the French Protestants. Probably 10,000 were killed in one night. Catherine de' Medici. These were the Huguenots. Yeah. These were the Huguenots.
We talked about this before.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then we get to this weird event of the 70s. In 1578, the younger son of the French king, the younger son of Catherine de' Medici, this is only 6 years after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, shows up seeking marriage with Elizabeth. And she is now 45 years old. This is kind of her last shot. She's actually charmed. She apparently wanted to marry him. She wanted to marry for love. Of course, she gives everybody nicknames. She nicknamed him her frog. She wrote poetry to her frog. But eventually the objections overrule the inclinations of her heart. A, he's French, which a lot of the English nobility are not happy about. B, he's Catholic, and there's no indication he's going to give up his Catholic faith. He will bring Catholic priests with him and want to celebrate Mass at least privately, and perhaps even, maybe he'll sway Elizabeth to rejoin the Catholic Church. And third, his mother is Catherine de' Medici. And so the English nobility and the Parliament are like, and Elizabeth's going, but I like him. He's very charming. He stays at court for 2 years and eventually leaves, and she writes this long, plaintive farewell poetry to him. But I think she's finally persuaded. She realizes that, yeah, the objections and the difficulties far outweigh the inclinations of her heart, but it was really her last shot. She's 45 when all of this is going on. In 1577, something else interesting occurs. She secretly authorizes Francis Drake, whose nickname is her little pirate, to conduct raids on Spanish shipping in the New World. And he conducts raids in 1577, 1585, and 1587. And he's basically a pirate. He captures the Spanish treasure fleet and hijacks their gold and silver that are coming from the mines in the New World. And the other little footnote to all of this is she had invested in his voyages and wound up making a huge personal profit when he sailed back into London.
How did she justify that?
She didn't. She just did it. It was never public. Historians have found all the documents, but yeah. Okay, next slide. Yeah, the 80s. So the 80s things heat up again. There are, at the beginning of the decade, William of Orange, who's leading the rebellion against the Spanish in the Netherlands. He's a Protestant. He's been seeking aid and alliance with the English. He is assassinated by one of his Catholic servants. Well, after the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, 1572, the assassination of William of Orange, Elizabeth's advisors are like, you got to stop going out in public. In 1584, Throckmorton plot exposed by Walsingham. Later that same year, the Perry plot exposed by Walsingham. And these are Catholic nobility conspiring with Jesuit advisors, apparently dispatched by the Pope to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. 1584, Burleigh actually organizes what he calls a bond of association, where a group of nobles actually take an oath to mutually support each other, and to anyone who should harm the Queen, they would, to their last breath, hunt them down and punish them. And they made it public. It was an attempt to deter anybody else from entering into a plot like that. It didn't. 1556 or 86, the Babington plot also exposed. You see Walsingham's name there. He's the head of her Secret Service. And the Babington plot had involved correspondence back and forth with Mary Stuart. They had intercepted letters proving that she not only knew about the plans, but endorsed them and was a willing participant. She's put on trial and executed in 1587, which leads to the Golden Age. Begins with a full-bore attempt by Philip of Spain to conquer England. He sends 150 ships and has 20,000 troops in the Spanish Netherlands waiting to rendezvous with the fleet to be transported across the channel and landed in England, and they quite likely could have conquered. Elizabeth didn't have an army large enough to defeat that number of Spanish soldiers. And miraculously, through the clever use of fire ships and small armed merchant ships, Francis Drake played a part in it. And then the Spanish panic with the fire ships and cut their anchor ropes and escape into the North Sea, never having picked up the soldiers in the Netherlands. And the storm in the North Sea drives them further and further north to where they have to return by going around the tip of Scotland, sailing south, then along the Irish coast. Probably half the fleet were wrecked in the storm, and the Irish murdered all the shipwrecked sailors who washed up on the shore because they're Irish. Yeah. So, and I just want to read you, I've got to bring this to a close here because we've almost gone an hour. I want to read you just 3 paragraphs of the speech that she gave in 1588 to give you a sample of her skill as a public speaker. And the speech she wrote, she goes out on horseback. You see a painting here. It's not contemporary, but it's imagining sort of what it would be. Don't let the helmets of the guys down there on the bottom fool you. Those are English soldiers. Everybody used the Spanish Moorian helmets because the Spanish had the best armor. But that was the pattern that they used. So she's out on horseback addressing her troops, expecting the Spanish troops to land. And she says, "My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of the battle to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and my people, my honor and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma of Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. I know already, for your forwardness you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you, in the word of a prince, they shall be duly paid to you. In the meantime, my lieutenant general shall be in my stead, than whom never prince commanded a more noble or worthy subject. Not doubting, but by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the camp, and your valor in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over those enemies of my God, of my kingdom, and of my people." Now here's the interesting footnote to that speech. Shakespeare was 14 that year. So I think some of the Henry V speech comes out of Elizabeth's speech at Tilbury. All right, let's get through this last couple of slides here. Go ahead and put all that up.
Did she deliver that in English, Rob?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. She's speaking to her people. The war with Spain continued, English privateers. There's exploration and colonization. The territory of Virginia is named after her because she's the Virgin Queen. There was an attempted colony at Roanoke during her reign that disappeared. There are Irish rebellions and succession worries. There are arguments that she became more authoritarian. There were court factions. She dies 1603 at age 69 and is succeeded by James VI of Scotland. So here's the summary on her. Next slide. Especially what she is remembered for is her patronage of poets, writers, and the arts. Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and of course, Will Shakespeare, because he grows up. In the 1590s, he's writing play, he's acting in London. His company performed frequently at court. Elizabeth almost certainly saw many of his plays. She requested a performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream. We have a letter that she sent asking that one to be performed. Many of his plays reflect Elizabethan themes: history, Henry V, politics, and national pride. Richard III, which was written in 1592, ends with the triumph of her grandfather, Henry VII. So, Shakespeare's works shape the enduring image of the Elizabethan era, but he only arrives on the stage in London in the last decade of her life because he wasn't born until 1574. Let me read you Susan Duran's conclusion, because I like her style and her approach. Now, I'll go back a little bit more than just this paragraph. Many admire her personal bravery and intellectual capacity. Professional historians, however, are far more critical about Elizabeth's personal qualities and skeptical about her personal achievements. Many condemn her for her vanity, her capriciousness, her indecisiveness, and a tendency to bully. They also tend to focus on the contemporary criticisms leveled against her rather than the plaudits and praise. Furthermore, it is becoming increasingly fashionable to marginalize the Queen in account of her reign and instead to give credit to William Cecil for its most significant outcomes, such as the Elizabethan church settlement. From this short biography, it should be evident that I do not share this negative view of the Queen, nor do I see her on the periphery of decision-making. Of course she had her character flaws, and inevitably she made mistakes. But she was a charismatic and hands-on ruler who proved a steady pair of hands during a period of political and religious ferment and helped save England from the religious wars that plagued her neighbors. And she ruled for 44 years and was peacefully succeeded by James, the sixth of Scotland, James I of England. All right, one final note. I want to announce the next set of lectures that I'm actually kind of excited about. So the summer series, the Pope, the Prime Minister, and the President. Because these are now historical figures. These are figures from my lifetime. And I had a hard time thinking about it, except I've been teaching high school students who have no memory of these people and haven't been taught anything about these people. And so the central role that they played and their collaboration with each other in ending the hegemony of the Soviet Union, in ending the tyranny of the Eastern European nations, of bringing down the Berlin Wall and freeing Poland and freeing Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Bulgaria from communist rule. So John Paul II becomes Pope in 1978. Margaret Thatcher becomes Prime Minister in 1979. Reagan, of course, is elected president in 1980, but we have an interregnum. He actually doesn't start as president until January of 81. But those three collaborated. So I'm going to spend one lecture on each of them to sort of tell their stories. And the stories of what happened. The 1980s changed the arc of history. The 20th century was going very badly. Even the 70s were not going well. And the 1980s changed the arc, changed the direction. And Paul Johnson in his book calls the 1980s the decade of the restoration of freedom. And it's these three people who are responsible. So I hope you'll come, listen to those, and we'll wrap it up for tonight.